Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. Today we have special guest Karl Widerquist returning to give us another talk. This time he's talking about basic income and private property. And his main argument is that private property can only be, in a sense, fair and just if you also have basic income in place. And beyond that, I'm looking forward to hearing what Karl has to say. Karl is a philosophy professor and he's a basic income expert. He's been writing about basic income for about 2 decades, but he's been a basic income supporter and enthusiast for about 4 decades. So it's always an honor and privilege to have Karl speak with us. So why don't you take it away, Karl?
Okay, I'm going to try to convince you of this political theory that I'm developing. It's called justice as the pursuit of accord, and the ideology that goes along with it I call independentarianism, an alternative to constructivism, to social contract theory, to libertarianism, to right or left libertarianism, to these other ideas. And it is a theory of justice that very much ends up, one of the policy ideas you get out of it is something very much like a basic income. Now, it's one that this theory has its roots rather than in Hobbes or in Locke. It has its roots more in Thomas Paine. It's very much a Painist sort of philosophy, with observations that there are systemic unfairnesses in the system that we have inherited from our ancestors. Now, natural rights theorists, such as right libertarians, will say, well, if we just get the right set of natural rights in place, that will fix all the injustices and everything will be fine and everything will be good and it will be good for everyone. Social contract theorists will say, well, what we need to do is create it like a contract, and we need something where we can justify it. That we can justify it so that there will be no reasonable objection. There'll always be some unreasonable people who object, but there won't be any reasonable objections. I have to get the door. I can't believe it.
Don't worry about it. Yeah. So yeah, this is independentarianism.
I didn't anticipate that. So. They will, and both think they have the answer. The social contrast theory, I have a contract that you can't refuse. Here's an offer you can't refuse. It is so good that if you refuse, you're unreasonable. And the property and the rights theorist will say, here is a set of rights that are so good and so reasonable that if you object to these rights, you're not just unreasonable, you're like a criminal. You must be a criminal if you don't like rights. Well, I didn't say I don't like rights. I don't like the set of rights that you said was the right thing. Now, the common complaint, and I say, the common complaint that people have been, oh, this set of rights actually turns out it's not good for everybody. People, well, let's get a better set of rights then. And people will say, this social contract theory, it's not good enough. It's actually not good for everybody. That it's not good for everybody. They'll say, oh, well, let's get one that really is good for everyone, one that no reasonable person could reject. We just got to improve it till we get that. And the idea of justice as the pursuit of accord is that you're never going to do that. You will never succeed. Maybe it's impossible. Maybe there's no core. There is no agreement that we could all come up with that we would all agree to, that every reasonable person would. Or even if there is a core where you could come up with something like that, the people in power never think they're unreasonable. The people in power, which might even be a majority of the people, have self-serving bias and other reasons to come up with an idea of a social contract or a set of rights that they think is totally reasonable, and the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged people, whether if that is women, if that's ethnic minorities, religious minorities, class, lower class people, people who are marginalized for whatever reason, the people in power will have self-serving bias that they can't really come up with something that no reasonable person could refuse. So we do not have something. We must always pursue accord, but we should never be so arrogant that we really have a contract that no one can reasonably refuse. So because of that, we have to realize that we have reasonable dissenters. We don't know how to eliminate that. What do we do with people who have reasonable objections? I argue in one of my earlier books that came out in 2013, Freedom is the Power to Say No, that one of the things that we need to do for dissenters is to mess with them as little as possible, interfere with them as little as possible. We got to make sure that the most marginalized people, we're asking as little of them as we can. And a system that has a work obligation is certainly not asking as little as people as we can. You could give them access to common resources, would be one thing, but you could give them access to common resources, but or if you're not giving people access to common resources, you could give them a basic income. That's the argument for basic income that I gave in that earlier book. Now, and that's a long, extensive book about what freedom is and why it's important and why you should always be able to object to whatever system of work or so on is available to you. That the people in power are making mistakes about how good your working conditions are made. They're not going to make them good enough for the lowest people. They're not going to make the pay reasonable enough for the lowest people. You need to be able to decide that you don't want to do it. That's the argument from Freedom is the Power to Say No. Now, there are other arguments that end up winding up being this. That's mostly for the system of government and so forth. Now, in the two more recent books, one called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy, which came out about 3 years ago now, and the one I'm working on now, which is called The Prehistory of Private Property, my co-author, Grant McCall, and I are addressing several arguments about the existing property rights system, and to some extent about the governments of the world that are untrue and that make factual claims that are untrue. And we address these arguments. We address these arguments and show with the facts how these are untrue. So the earlier book, the Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Theory, addressed basically one main idea: the claim that everybody today, that the property rights system makes everybody better off. There's a similar claim that the existence of government makes everybody better off. That first idea, that the property rights system makes everybody better off, is associated with John Locke. He talked about that as one of the reasons that justifies property. Property rights, he says, are good because it creates a market creates all these products, and these products are good for people, and then we're all going to be better off if we were all out being hunter-gatherers on common land. Hobbes argued that if we didn't have the state, we would have a bunch of crime, and that would cause all kinds of problems, and we wouldn't be able to do much of anything, and we would all be worse off. But these are two people who were writing in the 1600s. The stateless societies that they were aware of were stateless societies that their country, Britain, was conquering. They were going out on boats and ships and conquering native peoples, many of them stateless, They were going out and conquering them, and were developing all kinds of prejudice against it. So it was natural for them to say, you, the civilized man, are better than those naked savages. Even the lowliest one of you, the day laborer. Locke talks about a day laborer as being clad better than a king who's a master of naked savages or something like that. And that claim has been going on long before those two. You can trace this claim going back to the first Chinese emperor, who said he made everybody better off. Everybody that lived under his realm was better off than they weren't be. That's something that privileged people like to tell themselves. This system that gives me all these privileges, okay, maybe my privileges might be, maybe it's a little more than I deserve, but we all benefit from the system. So what's the big deal, if I'm a little bit ahead? The system's basically just. Nobody should reasonably refuse it. Everybody should be a part of it. Everybody should feel that they're a part of it, that it benefits them. They claim this, but if you actually see people research, if you look for research on it, where people, how do you prove that the lowliest person, the homeless person in New York on a cold day or during a coronavirus when all the public restrooms are closed, how do you prove that this person is better off than these stateless peoples? People say it like it's obvious. They say it like it's obvious, and it's not obvious. The people who are saying it's obvious, the two sides of that coin, how well off a homeless person is, and the other side, how well off a stateless person is in an indigenous community. Neither side of those coin is something most of us who are so convinced of the obvious fact of this claim, most of us have no experience with either side of that coin. We don't, it's certainly not obvious. And so what the book does is it goes through a bunch of chapters looking at first pinning down people that they really do make this claim, which with philosophers, you really got to work to pin them down and make sure you got them, that they are in fact saying that, they're basing their theories on that. Then we go through a lot of anthropology. My co-author is an anthropologist. We go through a lot of anthropology to show that we haven't made everyone better off. We could say within the last 100 years or less, we could finally say that the average person is better off, but the least among us is not better off. We keep telling ourselves this myth that we make everybody better off because we want to make the poor do stuff for us. We want them to be in that situation where they've got to contribute their labor. We say, well, you've got to contribute your labor because you're benefiting. Well, actually, no, they're not benefiting. Now, the book that I'm working on now, and that I'm almost finished with, addresses 3 more arguments that are made to justify the property rights system, and argue that none of them work. One is that equality is impossible. Another one is that property rights promote freedom. The property rights system we have, or even in a property rights system that's more unequal than we have, promotes freedom. And the idea that property rights are some sort of a natural right, and any community rights over the land are interference with this natural private property right. So and we debunk all of these with anthropological information. You'll find people making these claims. You pin them down that these are empirical claims they're making. You can't verify these ideas with pure a priori theory. You have to use empirical information to verify these. We go through a lot of the literature, finding who makes this claim, what evidence they use. You find very little evidence behind this claim. So we look at the evidence. We go to the anthropology and look at it. People have been saying, once again, since ancient times, people have been saying that inequality is impossible. That's probably, people have been saying that since that equality is impossible, or that it conflicts with freedom. Probably the first chiefs who put themselves at the top of a chiefdom started saying that. And we go through a history from then right up to the present day with all these conflicting reasons why it's impossible. But if you look at a lot of indigenous communities, which are not idyllic by any way, shape, or form, but you will find that there's a lot of cooperation and there's a lot of equality. That you find in very small scale societies that don't have chiefs, which is very rare in the world today, something so small that doesn't have a chief. If any of them are left that exist, you find that people are extremely equal, but you also find that they're extremely free. So this argument that they're free, that actually many of them have no really rules whatsoever. The rule is, if you want to camp with us, you share your meat with us, and we'll share our meat with you. And you're nice to each other. If you don't want to camp with us, then walk a mile out in the woods and camp by yourself. So they have hardly any rules. People are free from coercion, which is greatly free from coercion. There's occasional crime and fights and murders and things like that, and they don't have jails. Basically, their only penalty for murder is going to be a capital punishment. So it's not entirely peaceful, but neither is our society entirely peaceful. But it is a society that is equal. It's both very equal and very free. There's very little interference. Now, the property rights argument is supposed to be that property rights make us free. And that might be true for a billionaire. A billionaire is, and it might even be true for a middle-class person. A billionaire has lots of things they can do that others can't with all of their property. If all the land is in common and it's just out there for hunting, you can hunt, nobody's interfering with you, but there aren't a lot of opportunities. A lot of us have great opportunities, but if you look at a homeless person, the least advantaged people, they don't have a lot of they don't have things that they are free to do, that are freedoms, not opportunities. That is the absence of coercion, which is importantly how it's defined for these kinds of arguments. All they get is new forms of coercion. In the world today, very often you have to pay someone else for permission to urinate. That's not a big problem if you've already paid your rent, you own a home, and when you go out, you go to restaurants that provide restrooms, and you go to other places that provide restrooms. If you are homeless, that is a very major problem. You are unfree to build your own home. Well, for the first 200,000 years of existence, people were free to build their own home. They were free to hunt and gather their own food, to fish and farm their own food. All these really essential freedoms have been taken from them. And by coercion, people have taken it and taken the land and the resources we make out of land and said, this is my private property. You can't have it, or you're interfering with me. But when they do that, they impose a duty on you. You now have an obligation that you didn't have before. They're imposing an obligation on you that doesn't exist. So that means that the least free among us are less free in the world today than their ancestors were 20,000 years ago, in the sense that they are more often coerced, and they were coerced in ways that are more substantial. There are people who are prostituting themselves, who are selling their bodies for sex because that's what they need to do to get food, shelter, and clothing. That is a very high level of coercion. To create a property rights system that imposes duties on you so strong that you have no other way to keep yourself alive other than prostitution is a very strong obligation. That's a lot of coercion to impose on someone. Now, and it can be, even if you could do other things, if you have to be a migrant laborer, if you have to be someone with a dangerous job working in a meat packing industry, there are a lot of really low paid jobs that leave you very close to destitution, in very deep poverty in the world today. People take those jobs, they accept those working conditions because they have no other choice. And even well up into the middle class, it's hard to say how much better wages and working conditions would be if we had the ability, if we had the access to resources so that we could work for ourselves. We've gotten into our heads that working is synonymous with taking a job and taking orders. That's not what work is. That's employment. That is a job. Work can be doing things for yourselves. That option is taken from you. People interfere with you. They coerce you. They have imposed obligations, imposed duties on you that put you in this position. That means that many of us, in very important ways, are less free than our ancestors were long ago. The final thing is the argument that, well, all of this is justified because property is a natural right. That's a right. I mean, you have your rights. I have my rights. I expect you to respect the rights I have over my $1 billion worth of property, as I would respect your rights to property if you owned any property. But since you don't, and I do, I'll just fly around in my jet, and that's your problem. Now, that if that right is a natural right, maybe they have something going. But if that right is just something that powerful people imposed on all of us against our will, well, then there's not too much to it. So people who are trying to justify property as a natural right, almost invariably, I'm trying to say, well, why is this a right? How do you say this right? They'll tell this story. They'll tell this story that John Locke told, as far as I know, he's the first one to tell this story. Back in 1689, he tells the story of the mythical original appropriator. Someone, always a man in the story, at least in the early days. This man goes out into a virgin wilderness, never been used before. If it's been used by hunter-gatherers who don't count, goes out into the wilderness and clears the land, appropriates crops, thereby mixing his labor with the land and putting a little bit of his self into the land. And then the crops that grow up from the land have a bit of his self in. The land has his self in because he's improved it by clearing it, putting his house in it. And thereby we should respect that it's his land. He can do what he wants with it. And that's why property rights exist. And we can imagine everybody starting property this way, and then giving it to their children when they die, or gifting it to someone, or selling it to someone. And we could imagine trade and exchange going. And starting from this roots of this original appropriator, we can imagine the property rights system we have today. Well, we can imagine it. But what does that have to do with anything? You told me a fictional story. Well, I'll tell you a fictional story. Okay, here's a fictional story. Let's say a group of people go out together and they clear the land together. And they plant the crops together. And they create common access and land rights, and make sure everybody who is a member of this community gets access to the land. And we will make sure that everyone uses it responsibly, so we will be able to farm it and hunt on it and do the other things we need to do on it, raise it, use it as pasture and so forth. We will be able to do these things in the future. What if that's what the original appropriators decided to do? That's my fictional story. And these start out as small little tribes or whatever. But you can imagine these tribes as they get bigger and growing up. You could imagine them merging with other tribes. And maybe they have a defensive war where they get attacked by another tribe, but they win. So they get rectification from the people who attack them, and they get a little bit bigger. You could imagine that developing into something like a social democracy. A democratic state that might give out people titles to property, but not really moral rights over property. They have a government-generated title to property that is subject to taxation, regulation, and redistribution. That's my story. Locke had his story. What's the difference? And what we do in the book is we go through all this history of this story, going back in its roots, the roots of this claim, which extend even further back than Locke, right up to the present day, and finding the people who use this kind of theory. They like to call themselves libertarians. We call them propertarians because they put property ahead of liberty. And the people who make these arguments will often tell the story, but it's somehow relies on this idea that somehow appropriation is individual. Individuals appropriate, communities don't. Well, that's an empirical claim. Is that what happened? And you go through their evidence over 300 years of people telling this story, given this theory, appropriation principle, transfer principle, voluntary transfer, appropriation. They tell these stories, and you see little or no investigation to find out, well, what did the original appropriators decide to do? And how did we get here? Well, that's what we do in this book, The Prehistory of Private Property. We go through and we look at what small-scale indigenous groups tend to do. Nomadic hunters and gatherers tend to treat the entire land as a commons. That means it's open for anybody's use, but nobody's property. And that seems to be the oldest view of property, of land, that the land is something you can be close to and associated with, but it can never be yours, that the wild things of the earth belong to no one. You can take their fruits, but not the land. Now, when you get into settled communities, you do get senses of ownership, but they tend to be more at the community level. It becomes very much like in that second appropriation story, where a group of people goes and clears land together, and they have complex, you find very extreme complex rights to the land, and usually common access, where every individual has a right to hunt on some of the land, to farm on some of the land, and to maybe to pasture their animals on some of the land. These are going to be different parcels, and they might have the right to gather twigs on one kind of land and gather fruits and acorns on another part of land, where people have these common access rights, but not necessarily spatial rights over this plot is yours. Maybe for farming, you get one plot for the year, for the growing season. And then at the end of the growing season, it's pasture for everybody. And then the next growing season, you get another plot of land. You don't care which land you have, that you have land. That is extremely typical among small-scale agrarian communities. And you find that existed, there's good evidence that kind of community treatment existed in small-scale farming communities from as much as 10,000 years ago when farming was first being invented up until just a few hundred years ago. Now, you do have in cities, when cities start to develop, you have something approaching a property rights system beginning to develop, but that doesn't begin with appropriation. It begins from the top down. The first person to say, I own this as an individual, is a chief or a king. I own the whole place. It's all mine. And then when you get people saying, well, this chunk is mine, it is usually either someone who's very closely connected to the king, like the members of the king's family, or it is going to people who provide services for the family. Those are your original private appropriators, not a Lockean guy who went out in the woods, but it is the king's military men who went out and conquered the next village. And then the king says, now that village is your hacienda. That's your plantation. Those people are your employees if they're lucky, or they're your serfs or slaves if you're not. That's the original appropriator. The original appropriator is a government appointee. Even when the craft sector begins to develop, when you find scribes and pot makers and people are able to specialize in this, those people are selling things to government officials. It's very centralized in these things. There is none of this individual appropriation happening. To the extent that appropriation is happening, it is happening with these communities who are being encroached on by these more individualistic state societies. But even then, we go through this, getting to about the year 1400 or so, 14 or 1500. Even with that, you've got these cities with that kind of structure. You still have most of the rural areas of the world, or most of the non-city areas of the world, are either going to be still foraging territory, or they're going to be these agrarian territories. That's as late as 14 or 1500s, including in Europe. In Europe, most of the land, and it was still a very rural economy. So the majority of the people would have been living in some community like this. Now they're going to have some parasitic lord ruling over them. That's my dog in the background. They're going to have some parasitic lord ruling over them, and they'll have to pay tribute to them. But very often, they were pretty free to decide how to run their farming system. Often the lord was too busy doing lordly stuff like, I don't know, fox hunting or something. They didn't have time to go and look at them. So they actually he's like, just pay me my tribute. You guys do as you want. It wasn't a terrible life. And you find variations on this on all of the continents that had significant farming. And this is still as late as 14 or 1500s. What ended it? Well, what ended it was two parallel movements that happened at the same time, which was in Europe, the enclosure movement, and in the rest of the world, the colonial movement, where the power, and both of those were driven by European colonial powers. Alex, your ancestors and mine. Now, these although the more privileged, our lower class ancestors, I'm sure we have some of both, were as much victims as anybody else. They went around saying in Europe, the enclosure movement is like, well, these villages, those people on those villages, they're not really owners. They don't really own the right to go and farm here every year, or hunt in this area, or take gleanings in that area. They don't own that. They're just tenants. Those aren't real rights. Those are like customs or traditions, but they're not rights. The person with the right is the Lord. Well, he's not a lord. I mean, in Britain, where the enclosure movement started, we know where the lords come from. William the Conqueror conquered the country. He killed or subdued the existing lords. He brought his lords in from France and gave them baronies. And that's where British titled lords come from. That's where words like landlord and title to property, these reflect the government created origins of the property rights system. That's where it comes from. That's where it comes from in Europe. And at just about the same time, around the 14 and 1500s, they start exporting the system all over the world through the colonial movement. They don't get everywhere, but very often, by the time the Europeans leave, it's not completed, but very often privileged people in those countries, privileged indigenous people in those formerly conquered countries, they completed it for themselves, often for the benefit of European and American companies that want to do business. And that's still going on. There are still oil companies and mining companies and other kinds of companies, big farming companies that want to grow a bunch of bananas or something in Brazil are right now using those fires that Bolsonaro wouldn't put out and perhaps had set. They're using these things to take land from these kind of communities. The process that I'm talking about is not over. And this idea, this proprietarian idea that land is a natural right that begins with appropriation, this was part of that movement. It was part of the enclosure movement. It was part of the colonial movement. It played a propagandistic role. Locke and some of the others like William Blackstone, who were propagating these ideas, were aware that the kind of property rights they were talking about aren't what was the norm in most of Europe at the time. They were talking about what property ought to be, what they wanted it to be. They made it seem normal. So this idea of the original appropriator is a myth, quite literally a myth. And it is the most powerful myth, the kind of myth that we don't realize is a myth. the myth of Narcissus, that one, okay, we know that's a myth. We know it's not true. We might take some lessons from the story of Narcissus, but we know it's not literally true. But this one, we don't even know this. Is that really, it's just a myth. And now myths can be good. Myths can be good if they tell a greater truth. Adam and Eve, they used to, be totally innocent people that didn't know right from wrong. As soon as they ate from the tree of the fruit of knowledge, they learned how to do right and wrong, and they did some wrong things. That's why they need forgiveness. If that's kind of a metaphor for how a child grows up. But children are innocent. We're not, because we know the difference between right and wrong. That is a good myth. That is a myth that tells a greater truth. But if you look at the Adam and Eve story and say, well, it's all Eve's fault. Eve took the apple. If only Adam hadn't listened to women, we wouldn't be in this mess. So the moral of the story is women should be in a lot of pain when they give birth, and men should never listen to women. If that's the lesson you take from the story of Adam and Eve, you're missing the point, but also it's a destructive myth that tells the greater lie. And that's what this appropriation story is. So appropriation is not a natural right. It is something that privileged people forced on the rest of us. And here we are. It is 2020, and we've inherited this system with this horribly unjust past, that we don't know how to transform it into something that is going to satisfy everybody, that no reasonable person could object to. What do we do? What do we do with this system? There is no one agreement that is going to resolve all these problems. Well, part of the answer is from my earlier book from 2013, Freedom is the Power to Say No. Make sure you respect everybody's status as a free person by making sure there is no work obligation and you're not threatening people with homelessness and starvation if they refuse to do what you said. Now, you could do that by giving everybody access to the commons, by restoring the periphery and letting people have a commons. I don't know how realistic that is in the world today. But what is realistic instead, which Thomas Paine recognized more than 200 years ago, what we can do instead is we can provide everybody a basic income. Our ancestors, for thousands and thousands of years, provided everybody an in-kind basic income. There's land. Go hunt and gather as you wish. That is a form of basic income where you don't have to work for anybody else. You work only for yourself. Basic income, we don't have enough land to give you that. So we give you money instead. Those of us who own land, the government has imposed a duty on you by saying this land is my land and it's not your land. That is the imposition on you. They should be paying for that. And they should be paying for that enough that you can live off it. Now, that at least gets a base level idea. You're doing what? Are we still online? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My computer is screwing up here. Horrible time for it to do that. Okay. I can no longer.
I can still hear you and see you.
Okay, that's good. So the what's going to solve this Zoom problem? I don't know. Well, I can't see you. So I'm very sorry about this, but okay. Now, I was saying that what can we do to make an overall, not just this baseline idea, we're not going to force everybody to play. That's one thing. If you have a game that is not entirely fair, you don't force everybody to play. That's that original idea. But how can we make this the fairest system that we know how? Which is, well, we got to realize what we're really doing when we create property rights and when the government enforces property rights by coercively saying to those who don't have, you got to leave this alone so that person gets to have. You don't have, they have. Well, one way to do that would be just to divide everything. If you got a bunch of resources that we're here before we got here, we're gonna have them. One sensible way is just to divide them up. Okay, everybody gets an equal share. But it's hard to maintain an equal share. It's hard to maintain an equal share, especially if next generation is as much entitled to an equal share as everybody else. It's hard to maintain an equal share while you have a trading economy. If you want to trade what you have, well, it's not going to be equal anymore. So what you can do is to say, and you don't always want an equal share. Let me give you an example where you don't want an equal share. Say somebody needs to build, say we're on an island and somebody needs to build a well. Nobody wants to build a well. Okay, we could all say we will all take turns digging the well. Okay. And we say, fine, okay, we all take turns. That's one way to do it. But another way could be, well, when none of us really want to dig the well. So one guy just raises his hand and says, well, I'll dig the well if you give me a little more property than everybody else has. Well, that's okay. As long as everybody agrees to that, we all get a little bit less, but we get a well and we all get our water without putting any effort for it. So those who do more, those who own more, should pay a service, to those who own less. Now, so this is what I sort of call the endowment model. The endowment model of how to treat our resources is that when somebody wants something out of the commons, it's no longer common, it's going to be private, they pay back some sort of a service. So the more that you have privately, the more you should be paying. But what you're paying is not, the tax you're paying is not in the way we traditionally understand it. The way we traditionally understand taxes is that you have a natural right to your property. You have this natural right, but you want services from the government. And there's some incentive problems that we can't really sell you the services. So the services will be free or at a nominal cost, like roads and stoplights and things like that. We'll provide you these services, but we'll tax you. So it's like a transaction, but it's not voluntary because it's all mandatory. That's the way we think of taxes. And what I'm saying is we're thinking of taxes in the wrong way. Taxes are not a fee. It's not a reduction on your natural right for something you might want to buy from the government, like protection from invasion from another country. It's nothing like that. It is your payment for the right to own property. Why do millionaires pay taxes? For the right to be millionaires, for the right to take some property, all of the property in the world, including electronic property, including things that are online, are all made in part out of natural resources. You have nowhere to stand while you create your art unless there's some land on that. And so all of this stuff is made partly out of resources. You are paying for the resources you use, and you're receiving for the resources that other people use. If you pay more than you receive, that's your fee for being an above average consumer of resources. If you receive more than you pay, that's what you deserve for using less resources than other people. That is one basic idea, but then also we've got to decide other things. Now, that idea up to here, I'm very much the same as a group of people called left libertarians or Georgists, who argue that, well, there's a division between the value your labor adds and the natural value, the value of the land. That your labor adds one thing and the land adds another thing. And they'll say, well, we'll give you this share. We'll give you the share that you add in value in this share. And that is too easy. That's wishful thinking to think that you really can separate those things. That there is a mathematical objective distinction between how much this is gold shaped into gold and diamond shaped into a diamond ring. How much is contributed by the labor? How much is contributed by the value of the resources that went into it? There is no natural way to make that determination. It should be a negotiation. Ideally, we'd have a worldwide negotiation. We'd all agree everybody who puts in their labor gets that much and everybody who takes out a resource gets that much. We can't all agree to this. So we have to try to approximate an agreement. It's justice as the pursuit of accord, not justice as the attainment of accord. So through a democratic process, we create democratic managers who are managing our commons. And they are privatizing it with the goal, they are privatizing parts of it with the goal of maximizing the total value of the people's resources. For any resource that's privatized, it's not privatized because, oh, you're going to create jobs. It's going to be privatized because you are paying for it. You're promising to pay taxes, and we're making profit off of making this. With just the fact that you own this land or this mine or whatever it is, government should be profiting off that and giving that back to everybody else in the form of basic income. Then, but we're not going to privatize everything, and we're not going to price things on an open-ended basis. We're going to have regulations on that. We're not going to privatize such a way that you can pollute our rivers and our streams and then end up killing the very environment that sustains us. We're not going to privatize everything. We're going to keep roads and we're going to keep parks. And then if you charge a market value for these things, if you charge a market value for all these things that we privatize, then the banks and the landlords are making less money. They're the ones who are acting as if they own the earth right now. Because the landlord owns it, you can't afford to get it from the landlord, so you have to pay its value once to the landlord and once to the bank for the privileges of putting the money up to the landlord. That's what you're paying. You're paying them as if they owned the earth. Now I'm saying replace that with a rent that you pay to the government that is then redistributed to everybody else in the form of a basic income. And so the things you do to justify your ownership of resources is paying your taxes and obeying the regulations that make sure your property is managed. You get to manage a lot of it on your own. You get to decide what kind of company or what kind of religion you want to have on your property, if you want to make a church out of it or you want to make a factory out of it. But the government is deciding what kind of pollution you can have. And it needs to be a democratic process, and it needs to be open and protected from corruption, that the government really is maximizing its profit from what it sells and maximizing the total value of our resources, including the fact that our environment is valuable just as it is. Our environment sustains us, and we need a bigger and better environment. And we need, and if we did this, if we really charge, instead of giving the resources away for free and then taxing people back on an ad hoc basis, if we really charge for access to resources, we could have bigger parks. We could have more shared area, a much healthier environment, cleaner air and cleaner water, and we'd be making money off it, and lower taxes because people would be paying us for these things instead of banks and previous landlords. So that is the basics of the idea. And the basic of that idea is if you take something out of the commons, say it's no longer for everybody, you have to pay back to everybody else who lost access. Paying the old landlord doesn't do you any good. That's the guy who used to hold the duty over everybody else. What property is a duty. It is an obligation. When I say it is an obligation on everybody else, as I say, this land is mine, I impose a duty on everyone else. I put everyone else under obligation. I haven't paid for that. I bought the land that I'm sitting on right now. My wife and I bought that from the previous landlord. The previous landlord had duties over everybody else. I said to him, well, you hold a duty over everybody else in the universe. How much do I have to pay you to hold a duty over everybody in the universe? But I never paid everybody else in the universe. That's what I want to change. Is you stop paying the previous landlord, you stop paying the previous owner, and you start paying the people who really have to sacrifice for you to have profit. You pay everybody else for what you don't own. And you pay everybody else for what they don't own. They pay you for what you don't own. So you pay for what you own, you get paid for what you don't own. And the balance of that is the kind of thing we need to move towards to create a just society. We'll never reach it. We're always pursuing accord, but that's the kind of thing we need to do to move in that direction. Okay, thanks a lot. I'm ready to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Karl. Do you want to take a 2-minute break, or are you good?
Take a 2-minute break and then have questions.
All right, so we'll take a 2-minute break, and during this break, you guys can think about what questions you want to ask Karl. I'll probably ask the first question and my only question, but then I see that Austin has his hand up, And Adam has a question that he was asking on the live stream. So maybe he wants to ask that question. So we'll go me, and then Austin, and then Adam, and then Bethany, and anyone else can feel free to raise your hands as well. Usually at the end of these discussions, I announce what the next week is going to be. But since we're on a break right now, I'll do that now. So next week we have Leandro Ferreira talking with us briefly, and then we'll have a discussion. Leandro is the head of the Brazil Basic Income Network, and he's going to be talking about the income support system that's in place in Marica, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And they've got something, it's not quite a basic income because it doesn't go to everyone, but it goes to a lot of the citizens of that city. And interestingly, in response, it's a digital payment that goes to a debit card, and it's kind of a complementary currency. And in response to the COVID-19 crisis, it was very easy for them to kind of roll out their economic stimulus, because all they had to do was bump up the payment on these cards, on these accounts that a sizable chunk of their citizens were already getting. So that's going to be an exciting discussion. And now we can get back to questions for Karl. So I will start. So my question is, to what extent does the idea of rivalry play into your conception of property? If there's a good that only one person can consume, how do you decide who gets to use it without the concept of property and ownership? And what happens as human society scales up with land and other rivalrous resources becoming more scarce? Is property and property rights inevitable?
That's your question for me.
That's my question for you.
Okay. Well, it's very hard to go back to that counterfactual, and say what could have, because what you found is like over and over again, the imposition of this system is unjust, but the private property rights system was just so much injustice in it. But also the imposition of other systems was unjust. The imposition of the Chinese communist system, which is now basically a capitalist system, was unjust. The creation of centralized kingdoms such as ancient Egypt was so incredibly unjust. Now, but ancient Egypt created a very centralized economy, which is basically a top-down economy with very little private property. It didn't inevitably involve private property. It seems to me that the kind of property, the kind of economy we have would not do well if it was entirely centralized, even if you replace the pharaoh on top with a democratic constituency, that it would run into all kinds of problems if it was horribly centralized, that it would require some kind of private property. But I don't know if that's just my cultural bias from having grown up with the system. The private property system seems very normal to me, but I have a shortness of imagination, as all humans do, and I can't imagine I can't look at all the possible alternatives that haven't been thought of yet and say none of these will work. But what it does seem like that it can work is that we can have property, assuming we do need property, that property is the best way to go. And it has a lot of advantages. If you have property, the property rights system has lots of advantages. It gives you opportunities you don't have otherwise. Things you can do with, I'm not living in a tent that I've got to move out of the way of other people all the time, that I have this, that is mine, that I have a shower, nobody can come in and say, oh, shared shower, I'm just going to get in and we'll shower together. I don't want that. I want my shower. Nobody comes in unless I invite them. That seems to be that some institution like this is good, but that doesn't mean that it has to be the extremist kind of property that we're hearing so many arguments about about today, that there should be no taxes, no regulations, no redistribution. You can have a very good working market system where you have taxes and regulations and a lot of redistribution. And the redistribution is well, you need the regulations to protect our environment and our safety if they're good regulations. There are good and there are bad regulations, and we got plenty of bad ones, and that's always a problem for government. The opponents of all regulation do have a point that very often we do it wrong, but it's also the proponents of regulation are also right that that they are essential. The fact that we have no regulations is why our environment is collapsing around us while we speak. So we need some regulations, and we need the taxes. We need the taxes to ensure that everybody actually has some of this property system. I think property is good if you have it. You can't have a system where everybody has property without taxes and regulations, and you can't have one that's safe and working without some regulations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Austin, you're up.
Hi, thanks, Karl, for coming on. I think I've sent you some fan mail in the past. I'm a big fan of your work. And as Alex knows, I'm always chirping in on his CMT Discord, saying that it's important to have a philosophical and ideological grounding rather than just the economic arguments. So what you're doing is really exciting to me. I want to say very quickly that I think that the contemporary sort of philosophical question of, right now, I'm not free to just go into the forest and establish a hut and live independently. So the idea that society kind of owes me something for denying me those rights, I find completely convincing. What I find less convincing is perhaps the anthropological account of, I feel like maybe you go too far from the sort of homesteading myth all the way to the sort of Rousseauian noble savage myth, where societies, pre-modern societies, you use the word free a lot. And I think that if you look at indigenous societies and small societies, you see there's actually a lot of complex sort of claim systems about who can do what, where, and that's part of, social systems that are quite prescriptive in a lot of ways, down to like who can marry who and what rights get passed on with marriage and family. And so it might not be ownership in the sense that we consider it, but I think it may be a bit too simplistic to say there's just these commons and everyone is sort of free to use it. And following on from that, I wonder what you think of Pinker's anthropological account of violence, and Graeber's account of money, which seems to me to fit with your sort of top-down account of the sort of top-down account of property emanates from the state, whereas Graeber seems to say money emanates from the state. It doesn't emerge bottom-up from barter. I was also going to ask you what you think about Piketty, but I'll skip that one because I've probably asked too many already.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot there. Now let me see.
But I said it really fast, so yeah. that makes it better.
Yeah, so I'll try to take those backwards. Yeah, Graeber's account, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, is an amazing book. We cite it a lot, I believe, in both of our books. It's really relevant for a lot of stuff we're doing. Now, Steven Pinker, I think he takes more of his argument than he can. What Pinker is saying, the really important thing that he's saying is that what makes a person peaceful is living in a peaceful society. Violence creates violence, peace creates peace. The more violent your society, the more you are likely to be violent. And then when you put violence down, you make sure people are safe for violence, they're less brutalized, and they don't. And he goes over an enormous amount of evidence from the very violent societies that we had 500 years ago to our societies today, that violence really has trended down. And that is notwithstanding the world wars and the wars that are going on right now. That violence has trended down on a per capita basis very much in the last 500 years. But what he does, the mistake that he makes, is that he thinks that Hobbes had the reason why. It's because of the sovereign, the sole unified sovereign, bringing us a state where there will otherwise be chaos. Well, 500 years ago, all those societies we're looking at 500 years ago were state societies that had sovereigns. The sovereign was just doing a very bad job of keeping violence down. As a matter of fact, the sovereigns were usually the ones propagating the violence. So he was wrong to think that what he was doing was really Hobbesian. And when you go back further than 500 years, his evidence of things, he just sort of extrapolates a trend. And we all do this. It's the phrase for it is 1, 2, 3 infinity, is that people are really good at recognizing a trend. They see a trend going and then they extrapolate it to infinity. You say, look, violence has been going down for 500 years. There's all fantastic evidence going back for 500 years. Obviously, what we can see is violence has been trending down forever. My evidence gets really weak after that, but you get the idea, it's probably the same. Well, he's mistaken. The evidence, if you actually look in our book that's already out, our book about this hypothesis that everybody's better off, is that those states 500 years ago were no less violent, and in some cases more violent than a lot of indigenous communities that are stateless. And so he takes the trend a little too far. He's got some of it right and he's got some of it wrong with Steven Pinker. Now, but I think your deeper question was the one you okay. Then you had another question about Rousseau, and this is something anybody who writes a book like this has to face, is the noble savage allegation. Oh, you said something nice about native peoples. Oh, you must be romanticizing them like the noble savage. Well, actually, the term noble savage was created in the 1850s by a group of proto-anthropologists that thought that their burgeoning field of anthropology wasn't racist enough at the time, that they were saying too many good things about native peoples when we all know that white peoples are superior. And they invented this phrase that they attributed to Rousseau, even though Rousseau never used the phrase noble savage. And they said that you're romanticizing these native peoples. And this happens. So if you say anything good about indigenous peoples, you will get this allegation leveled at you. And for 170 years, it's worked perfectly, is that people then tend to err on the side of making sure they always say something negative. They don't go too far when they say something nice about native peoples. And that's one of the few groups in the world that it's like that. Imagine if I wanted to say something good about the Swedish banking system and I had to face the allegation that that I was romanticizing the polite Viking, or if I said something good about the Scottish government, if I was to say, "Oh, you're romanticizing the generous Scotsman," or maybe in Ireland the sober Irishman. If there were terms like this, it would prejudice the things against taking lessons from them. People in indigenous communities are not some romantic ideal. And but they're not naked savages either. They are people like us living in very different circumstances. And that's what anthropology can do. It can learn from people who are in different circumstances. And you are right that many indigenous communities have a lot of bad things about them. And many of them are not free. But also, most indigenous communities were state societies long before colonial got them. One trend that you do see that I think is very solid is the greater access that individuals have to the commons, the freer they are from authority, the more they can live their life the way they want, and the less they have to take orders from chiefs and lords and kings. That I can say is a solid trend. The book's not out yet. I'm almost done with it. It's called The Prehistory of Private Property. There's some of it in our earlier book, The Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. There's a lot more coming out in this book. A solid trend that the better access people have to the commons, the freer they are. That doesn't mean they're free from violence. Freedom from violence is one thing, freedom to access the commons, freedom from taking orders is another. Some of those societies are very peaceful, some are very violent, but the societies where people have access to the commons tend to be very free. Now that is a lesson for us. Access to the commons, what it does is it gives power to the individual. And this is one thing that Rousseau got right. Rousseau said, it is possible to make a man a slave until you first make it so he cannot do without other people. If you take away access to the commons, then the common person has to go to the owners of what used to be the commons and go say to them, oh, can I do some work for you, sir, good sir, kind Lord? May I work for you? May I get a job for you? I will fill out your employment form. They get less power. The access to the commons gives you power. How can we restore that in the world today? Universal basic income. Basic income is power. It is the power to say no to those powers, those more powerful people than you. And we don't know how far it's going to go. It's not the be all and end all. It won't end all violence. It won't end all sexism, but it will make it so women can escape. Women can escape abusive husbands, and workers can refuse jobs that have horrible working conditions and low pay.
Okay, so did you see Austin's follow-up in the chat? He says, I am not so much...
I'm still not going to look at the chat. I can't
Okay,
talk,
that's fine.
I can't listen and read or talk and read at the same time.
I'll read it for you. So he said, I am not so much concerned with good and bad, but whether it was really a system where people had free access to a commons, or whether that was regulated by rules and claim systems, which were not always egalitarian.
That again is going to depend on society. When you're talking about indigenous communities, you know, your indigenous state, even confining yourself to stateless societies, you're talking about thousands of very, very small societies. Then you multiply that by them changing over time, there can be lots of different ways. Usually a hunting and a territory that is used for hunting and gathering is going to be almost entirely unregulated. You can't be in your nomadic group of 50 people. You can't be lord over them, because what a nomadic group of 50 people who are hunters and gatherers, what you need to do is all 50 people have to go out and hunt and gather and then bring their stuff back and share it. You want to be lord of these people. You do things my way. I'm the king. I stay here. You guys go hunt. They're like, okay, yeah, we'll go off and hunt. They're going to go off and hunt, and they're not going to come back. If you got to make them free to hunt, you can't really make them come back, and you can't. So the system really doesn't work with so many power in that kind of system. Now there are some kinds of small scale indigenous communities where there's very little land, a few miles square, and they're surrounded by enemies. On those kind of indigenous communities, violent men, and it is almost always the most violent ones are the violent men, are almost always men. These people become valuable allies instead of dangerous people that we might want to ask to leave. These violent people very often take charge, and they can lord it over you in horrible ways. So yes, there are very horrible indigenous communities, but this goes on with access to the commons. Now, also there's other kinds, and agricultural commons. And agricultural commons can be very good shared access, and it can also be very top-down. It can be an agricultural commons could be a few hundred likely situated families, husband and wife, kids, who knows, maybe some same-sex couples, and like situation families that are getting together and talking about, how do we work this? What kind of crops can we grow that are going to work here that aren't going to deplete the soil? What kind of animals can we grow? Can we graze here? And how much land do we need to that? In those cases, the regulations are going to be the stuff that the community thinks is reasonable. But you might also get one that gets more power to the top and less of this, and it's going to be about what's good for the Lord, not what's good for everybody. yes, there's a big, enormous range of indigenous communities. I'm not saying do this because this is what our ancestors did, or this is what our cousins in indigenous communities say do. I'm doing those for things like this that have been observed to work. Let's see if we can take institutions like that, like make our institutions a little more like that. How can we make our regulation of private property more like a community getting together and say, how do we both have the kind of businesses we want to make our economic lives thrive and have the entire environment we need to keep living in the future and not all get sick? What kind of power do we have to concede to our least advantaged? What kind of power do we have to concede to our least advantaged individuals to make sure that we, as the group making the decisions, aren't lording it over them? And that, I think there's very good evidence throughout the histories that the more access they have to the commons, the freer they are. And that's why we need something that, well, that is one lesson, one of many lessons that say why we need something like basic income.
Whoops. Okay, I thought I unmuted myself, but I didn't. Okay, great. So Austin has a few more comments, and maybe we'll get to them again if we have time. Austin, if you want to raise your hand, you can actually ask your next question after we get through a few more people. So let's go to Adam.
Hi, Carl. I really appreciate your presentation. I love how you arrive at UBI. I think it's amazing to come through that philosophical route that goes through who deserves to have access to the land. I think that's amazing, and it really resonates with me. And that's how I arrive at UBI. And reading Henry George was a life-changing experience for me. And I had a question about, I had a different question, so I think I'll change my question, because you actually answered my first question later in the presentation, which had to do with, should UBI be based in some part on land rents? And obviously it seems the answer is yes. But I want to piggyback on something that Alex asked, which is about rival risk goods and people who maybe all have legitimate requests to use some natural resource. So let's say that in the example of the well, instead of one person raising their hand and said, yeah, I'll build the well, what if 10 people raise their hand and say, yeah, I'd like to build the well, and they all kind of have 10 different ways of doing it that have pros and cons, and maybe it's not just about the money. Maybe one wants to can do it for cheaper, but maybe it's going to damage the environment in some way, or there's these trade-offs like that. And you mentioned regulations, which I think is amazing, and I think that's where I felt like Henry George kind of fell short, was he didn't go much into detail about our common care for these resources that goes beyond just putting them on the market for the highest price and then collecting rent or property tax on that. So so with these kind of case by case situations where you have to decide between 10 different contractors or people who want to take temporary or permanent ownership of some parcel of land, how do you see democracy playing into that? Because when you talk about when we talk about access to commons, is access just meaning that I guess basically it means I collect rent, I collect basic income, but where does it enter in that I also, as a citizen of the world, get to help decide what among these 10 people who would be the best? Which trade-offs am I okay with? Have you thought about how that sort of participation in these decisions might take place? And have you thought about types of democracy that might lend themselves to something like that? Maybe a liquid democracy or something like that. So
what was the name of the type of democracy?
liquid democracy. So a delegative democracy where you say, well, if I don't know about, if I'm not an expert enough to decide on this, I still have a share of a vote. So I can elect an expert to vote on my behalf. That's kind of the core principle of a liquid democracy. Okay.
Okay, that's good. There was a lot in there too, like the last guy's question. There are certain regulations that you can't have because they're horrific and have also kinds of bad effects. Okay, you cannot say we're the community, we're the democracy, we get to regulate, and we're a majority Protestant. So if you want to build a church, got to be a Protestant church. Okay, we only want Protestant churches. None of those Catholic churches. None of those Mormon churches. It's going to be is that the land has to be available for any legal use. And anything that doesn't harm other people, that doesn't harm anybody who's not a consenting adult, you got to let them do it. And you got to do it on the same terms. You can't say we like Protestants better than Catholics, so Protestants pay less for their churches than the Catholic. Pay less for the land that their church is on. That you can't do. It's got to have real effects on the community. But there are other things that do have real effects on the community. I look at the Chrysler Building in New York, and I see a very beautiful building. I look at the Trump Tower, and I see a very ugly building. And those kind of regulations, you're putting a monument up that you're using all kinds of resources. You're taking some of those valuable real estate in the country and all kinds of other resources that go into this, and you're going to build something that's going to affect every person who visits or lives in or looks at a picture of New York for hundreds of years. Yeah, I think you could have some style regulations, but style regulations could go too far. And now we need to make the government more responsive and make it freer of regulations. The regulations also can't be too burdensome. You can't make it so every single building that gets built, you've got to go through the New York City Council or some special service to get to. That would make it too cumbersome. It has to be easy and working. People have talked about ideas like deliberative democracy. Liquid democracy sounds interesting. It's a new one on me. I haven't looked deeply at a lot of these alternatives. I think we need to move in those directions, but I have two ideas about that. One is we will always be in the state of the pursuit of accord. We'll never reach it. And that is a problem with the United States today, is that everybody has to say how we're the greatest country on earth, we have the world's best constitution, and we have to pretend everything's perfect here. Well, the framers did some good things. There were some good things in the Bill of Rights. The 3/5 compromise wasn't so good. There was some bad, leaving women out was an awfully bad thing. There was some good and bad in there. There's some good things in that Constitution. But what that does is get you away from experimentation. Is that what we need to be doing is experimenting with better and better forms of democracy. Try different things. Try democracy by lot. Try ranked choice voting. Try proportional representation. Try them in different states. We have 50 states. Imagine if all the 50 states were experimenting with different forms of democracy for years and years, and we're taking the ones that were most responsive to the people and propagating those, not the one that gives my party or that party an advantage, trying to find a way to do that. So that's what I mean by experimental democracy. Keep trying things, set it up so you can try different things. But of course, you don't try things like dictatorship. It's got to be basically on one right, that the goal and the guarantee is that everybody, the king of all other rights, is to have equal. Every citizen has to have equal power in the decision making, and we're so far from that. If that's what a democracy is, the United States is very far from a democracy or a weighted democracy, where the more money you have, the more influence you have. If you look, the people do vote, but they vote for representatives, and the representatives vote for what the donors want. So what we really have, when the point is not voting for representatives, the point is influencing the policy. That's where the donors control it. That's why the United States is not truly a democracy. So we need to experiment on a lot of systems, but get rid of this money-driven system we have and find and look at, is the system really one person, one share of influence? And what system works best? If we move from here to that, whatever else we do will be so much better. But we can still improve things with deliberative democracy, liquid democracy, other ideas, all the other things we talked about. Now, but there's one more thing. I said there were two things. One is experiment. The other is, there's three things. Experiment, every person has equal influence. But the third thing is you will never succeed. You will never get the perfect one. And what's always going to happen, what always happens in the best democracy in the world is people disagree. Reasonable people disagree. And the majority, if it's a good democracy, the majority has their way. The majority has their way. In a bad democracy, the donors get their way. But the majority gets their way. But the majority gets their way, and they will tend to do things that are self-serving and not fully empathetic with the people who didn't get their way. And that's why you need this always present idea that there are these dissenters that were opposing not just property rights on them that they didn't get a share, but all kinds of rules, some of which will be objectable. There might be a human being in the world who actually thinks Trump Tower is better than the Chrysler Building. And if I go and say, things have to look more like the Chrysler Building than Trump Tower, then, maybe he's right and I'm wrong, and if I've won the debate and I've imposed it on him, little things like that, we have to recommend. That's one of the reasons you get a basic income, is that's your compensation for all these rules being opposed on you. And some of those are things that you can reasonably object to.
Okay, so the next three questions are going to be Bethany, and then I have a question from Jay Gannon on the YouTube chat, and then we're going to go to Steve.
Hi, thanks so much, Karl. It's always really interesting to hear from you, and I appreciate you taking the time. So I think in terms of the premise or the basic idea of sort of reviewing what small scale societies do, I do find that fairly compelling in combating this idea that there's like one idea of property, precisely the way that we do it, that's more natural or something like that. But I'm kind of already with you on that point. So the thing that I'm wondering more about is, what is the value of taking how small scale societies do things as an influence in thinking about how we should do things? And the reason I'm skeptical of that is because it just seems like there are so many differences in circumstances, including scale, including amount of observability of different people's behaviors because of scale, including possibly the ability to stockpile a lot of resources, lots and lots of things that just aren't likely to change, that we maybe don't want to change because we benefit a lot from scale, that we maybe couldn't change because we have too much population to live at that scale, so on and so forth. So then the question is, what does this kind of sort of commons argument or argument based on small scale societies give us above and beyond just looking at our current society and saying, how can we make people better off, or as well off as we can, right, without really worrying about what other groups of people have done. And then I kind of have like a smaller question for you, so I'll throw that in too. Given that kind of perspective, it seems like one way to try to think about how to treat certain kinds of property, like real estate property, would be to think about how to get the incentives right for people investing in development or whatever that we would want them to do for the public good, but obviously not having too many of these other kinds of costs that you talk about. So that would be a more natural way for me to think about it. So that's sort of my smaller picture point. But yeah, I threw two out at you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand the second question. Can you?
Oh, okay.
So let me answer the first one.
Yeah, I'll happily rephrase the second question later on.
Okay, and then answer the first one and then rephrase the second. Okay,
great.
So now, the two books where I outlined my theory, and those two books I'm writing. Well, I wrote and I'm writing the other one all by myself. Those two books are not the books about prehistory. Those books take modern analysis and analysis of other political and philosophical theories and argue on those bases. I do not take these lessons from these small scale societies as being a primary reason to do anything. The two books on prehistory are not, for the most part, about, well, they're not in any way, shape, or form are they of this sort of form. It's not because our ancestors did it like this, we need to do it like that. I do not do that. My co-author and I do not do that. We do occasionally say, well, this works, that doesn't work. Let's do something like this. Let's not do something like that. We do that occasionally in the book, but that's not the main thrust of those books. Those books are debunking books. The Prehistory of Private Property and Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. Those books are debunking books. Those books are about people who do say, it was like this in the past, therefore we need to do it like that in the future. Hobbes says, before there was government, there was violence and chaos and everyone was a naked savage. Therefore, you got to do whatever the king says. And that's basically his argument. Do whatever the king says. Unless he wants to chop your head off, then you can try to run away. But probably by then it'll kill you. And we're saying that's crap. Locke says, before there was private property, everybody was a poor, naked savage. Private property made you wealthy, even the lowliest day laborer. We're saying, is that true? No, it's not true. We got loads of evidence saying that is false. Our homeless people are worse off than our ancestors. What we mean is these arguments for the state and private property system don't work. Okay, in the second book, the section about equality, they say equality is impossible. Well, no, here's some indigenous communities that have equality and they don't sacrifice freedom. And the least free people in some indigenous communities are actually not as coerced as much as our societies, where homeless and economically marginal people can be interfered with in very significant ways that make their lives really hard to live in their own way. So these claims are false. The claim that Locke is probably the biggest, because we started property when some mythical original appropriator went out and mixed his labor with the land, then we have to have a property rights system. Well, that's not the way it happened. So all of those are about debunking. We draw some lessons along the way, but the primary thing is those people who said we did it that way in the past, therefore we have this system now, those people are wrong. That's the point of those books. Okay, now your other question.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so my other question, can you hear me? Because Alex muted me before. You can. Okay, great. So my other question was about, you were talking about, say, how to tax landlords, or how to think about how much to tax a landlord, for example, or a property owner. And one perspective that comes naturally to me is to think about the amount of incentive versus disincentive that you want that person to have to buy the property in the first place and maybe develop it or do something socially beneficial with it. And if you look at empirical studies, obviously places with certain kinds of property protections or incentives, you might call it, to buy property or to develop property, they can end up with some social goods that everybody benefits from. So I'm interested in how you kind of integrate the incentive of the property owner into your thinking about, how much to tax, say, the ownership of property. Does that question make more sense now that I've rephrased it?
Well, yeah.
Like just to make sure it's really clear, if you were to tax somebody too much, then they might never, develop any interesting property, buildings or right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the point.
Yeah, there is a highest sustainable tax. Now there's a profit maximizing tax, and there's a highest sustainable tax, and there's different things in between. There are often good reasons to go higher than the profit maximizing tax. But you never really want to go higher than something that's sustainable. If it's unsustainable, if you're gonna bankrupt your society and choke everything off with too many incentives, too many disincentives by doing this, nobody wants that. Now, but the profit maximizing tax is not necessarily the best one, because profit is not all there is to resources. The government started out with this enormous endowment. It owns all this land, all the majority of the land. They just stole it from the Indians. But what did? They started giving it away to privileged people. They had this enormous endowment, and they got nothing to show for it. Well, okay, they could make some recompense with the indigenous people, which we still haven't done, and the amount of reparations we owe to some of the most disadvantaged native groups is important. But even going on from there, what do we do when we privatize this? One thing we do is that we get profit when we sell stuff, but the environment is not a thing that's just sitting there, that's not doing anything before we privatize it. That's what people used to think. The area in between, when Europe was dotted with these little farming villages, the area between them was called the wasteland. It's wasted because it wasn't being farmed. Now we think about wasteland, we think about a toxic waste dump. That's what wasteland is. All of that area in between those little farming villages was hugely valuable land for two reasons. One, people could walk on it and hunt and gather and all do all that kind of stuff on it. And that was hugely important for the economy and for people's freedom to be free to do that. But another thing was, that's where animals live. That's where plants live. That's where our oxygen is made. That's where the entire environment that sustains us is. We've got to raise the prices really above the profit maximizing level so that people don't have an incentive to use up every last resource. So somewhere between the profit maximizing level and the unsustainable level, somewhere in there is the desirable level.
Great. I think we're on the same page. Thanks, Karl.
That didn't really come through, Bethany. Can you say it again?
Oh, I just said that'll make sense. And I think we're on the same page. And thanks. That wasn't anything important. Thanks so much, Karl.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So our next question is from Jay Gannon on the YouTube live stream. And he says, I get resistance from others on economics blogs about property taxes as they lock you into another payment paradigm. What about taxing consumption and usury instead?
Well, I didn't. Now, whenever you talk about the ownership of resources, this is one enduring influence of Henry George, is that when you talk about resources, people talk about taxes directly on the resource. And he had this idea of simply separating the resource value. A property tax is not a land value tax. A property tax taxes both the land that the building is on and the value of the building, the total value of the property. So you improve your building, your taxes go up. You make the building a little crappier, the taxes go down. That's not such a good incentive. What Henry George said, and I think it's a really good idea, is taxing the value of the land, not the total value of the property. It's good because nobody created the land value. The land, they created the building value, maybe. That's the moral reason he did it. But it gives a really good incentive because then you take a lot of the speculation out of it. You don't just buy land and sit there hoping its value is going to go up, because its value goes up, your taxes go up. You're not going to do it. It's good for speculation. That is really good. The problem is that we have property taxes all across the country instead of land taxes. Now, there are a lot of property taxes where we don't have. The government gives away the broadcast spectrum for free. That should be sold at least at the profit maximizing level, maybe a little higher to keep some frequencies open in case we need them for an emergency or something. Now, or some new technology comes along and we want something open for that. A lot more taxes like that are open to do. Now, things like taxing usury, we need to get if you're paying more in land value taxes and less to the previous landlord to buy your land, then you're going to be paying less to the banks. You're already undercutting the banks. There's a lot of ways you could get to that. You could get to that by nationalizing the banks. I've heard of these programs. I don't, postal banking and stuff. I haven't looked into them. Not something I'm an expert on about which of these taxes are going to work the best. Now, Andrew Yang, who's done a lot to support basic income, has said something that I'm pretty skeptical about. He wants a consumption tax. He wants a value-added tax as an alternative to the wealth tax. Now, to a Georgist, this would be anathema. You can't tax anything but land. Even though I'm a moral sense, I'm a Painist in the way George was. What I mean, I'm a Thomas Painist, and George was a Painist, is that I take Paine's observation because no one naturally owns the land. Anybody that takes the land should pay back to everybody else. Morally, that's the justification for taxes. But that I don't take that the way George does. Then you tax land and everything else. A lot of good reason to tax land. The moral argument is not one of them, because every piece of property is made partly out of resources, and there's no true right way to say this part of the value came from the land or other resources, and this part came from labor and ingenuity. Actually, those are subjective ideas. You change the background position of everybody involved, and all of those values change. There is no true land value. So I've got nothing against a consumption tax if it works. Andrew Yang claims that you're going to get more from businesses from a value-added tax than you would get from them with a wealth tax. I'm really skeptical about that, but I haven't looked into it. He's looked into it. I'm writing a book, and after that, I have 2 other books I have to write. I'm not looking into it in a deep way this time soon. That I have to remain agnostic about. My perspective is not about this form of democracy is best. Experiment with democracy. Also, not this form of tax is best. Experiment with those. And pay for more studies that are going to tell us which kind of these taxes are going to get the revenue with creating the fewest disincentive problems. We don't even need to do that when we think about taxes. We just say, oh, let's have a movement for this tax. It should be a lot wonkier, the way we decide which taxes we use.
Okay, we're going to go to Steve, and then we're going to go to Brian's question on the live stream.
Thanks. Karl, I wonder if you could say anything about the education of children in a stateless hunter-gatherer band. It seems like if the grown-ups coerce, well, if the grown-ups don't coerce the children to learn, then it's thought that children won't learn anything. If the grown-ups do coerce the children, then it seems like there's a built-in hierarchical system that it's human nature. And so you wouldn't be surprised in a coercive educational system to have a hierarchy of, students, teachers, chieftains, lords, sovereigns.
Well, I could answer this entirely without reference to stateless societies. A lot of things we have use hierarchy where you don't always need it. Our idea, every job is you go in and take orders from your superior, who has a superior, has to go up to the CEO. And you go into school and the teacher tells you what you need to learn, you take orders from there, and the teacher is below somebody else. All this hierarchy and very little choice of the people on the end. Now, there are a couple of theories of teaching. I think one is Montessori schools and another one is Paideia schools that find, do we really need this? Do we really need to take the kids? Okay, now at 9 o'clock you do reading, at 10 o'clock you do writing, at 11 o'clock you do arithmetic. Do we need to regiment the kids like this? Or can we let the kids figure out what do they want to learn? And I think those are the right names of the type of schools that have experimented with it. It's like, let's let the kids direct. You find out kids get to be school age and they really want to learn to read. Kids really want to learn to read, and you don't have to force them to learn to read. They will do it. And I haven't looked into a great deal of education, about education in stateless societies, but you do find that people grow up and there's a lot of regimentation. That much I know. There's not a lot of hierarchy, even with kids. the freedom that they treat each other with, also in the nomadic societies, the loosest ones, the ones that there are a few of left, and the ones that are most different than our society. Very often, not a lot of supervision of kids, but you find that the kids learn the skills they need, and the parents will teach them. The kids will observe. The kids will play, imitate the parents, and then they'll do what the parents were doing. And everybody grows up as being an expert hunter and gatherer. So they don't need the regimentation and the hierarchy to do it, is my impression from what I've read. I haven't really specifically looked so much into education. There's a lot of other societies. There's a lot of societies where teaching people bad stuff. I mean, there's indigenous communities where everybody believes that males have this magical life force in them, and it comes out in their sperm, and without ingesting sperm, women couldn't have babies. They couldn't give breast milk. And that means men are just more spiritual and more giving. They're givers, women are takers, because men create the sperm and women don't. Oh, by the way, kids couldn't reach puberty with this. So men should be having sex with kids that are about to reach puberty in order to help them reach puberty by giving them that magical life force in their sperm. That's pretty horrific. You got to do some regimental teaching, but there are people that do it. So not all indigenous societies have really good education. There's some bad stuff in there, but I think there is some idea that less regimentation is a good idea.
Okay, so we will go to Brian's question on the live stream, which I'll read for you, and then back to Austin for his follow-up. So Brian says, how would independentarianism handle the oceans? Private, common, or some hybrid?
That is a good question. And people often cite Roman law for being actually kind of not very good interpretations of Roman law, being supporting private property. But Roman law began with a presumption that I think forests, streams, lakes, beaches, and seas could not be anyone's property. They just began with that presumption. Other things could be. Those things, I'm not sure forest was one of those, but the others definitely were, that some things should not be property. The oceans are for one, well, if nothing else, they are the highway system between nations. And without some commons to get from one place to another, you need that. So I'm very skeptical about the privatization of the oceans. And that is what's going on. It used to be that the limit of territorial waters was a couple miles offshore. And then they made it 6 miles. Then they made it 12 miles. And then people started extending like these 500-mile shipping limit or fishing limits, or 200 miles. Just these enormous claims of waters. And then with offshore oil drilling, and now like oil drilling that's actually bottom of the sea oil and mining, they're talking about starting where you don't even need a platform at the top. They're essentially privatizing the oceans. And we've seen the bad in the privatizing the oceans with all of the offshore oil spills we've had. But there's also a bad in the unregulated commons of the oceans, which we see in drift nets and we see in the pollution in the ocean. The ocean is filling up with our fertilizer and our insecticides and our pesticides are all going in the ocean, and they're killing the basis of our food chain. Then you have our plastics and things going in that's killing other stuff. Fish are eating the plastics and dying of starvation because they have this. But on the top of that, you have people going out in international waters with large drift nets, and they're just capturing everything. If you say this should always be a commons and totally unregulated commons, it's quite clear with the size of the population, the type of industrialization that we have, we're going to end up with a fished out, polluted, dead ocean. And if we do that, life on Earth could come to an end. Global warming, I don't think can end life on Earth, but destroying the oceans could. I don't think global warming is a big threat, but this kind of stuff is a bigger threat. Not to mention we got Fukushima pumping out all of this stuff into the ocean. So the oceans need to be somehow regulated to get equal access to people. Now, how to do it? I've not looked into the law of the sea. I do not know how to do it. I know it's really hard because it's really big. But I also know that the Roman Empire ended piracy there was no piracy in the Mediterranean from the time of Julius Caesar until the time when the first of the barbarian invaders reached the Mediterranean. And then it came back for over 1,000 years of piracy in the Mediterranean. But there's a good 400 or 500 years with no piracy. We still have piracy in the oceans. We have piracy off Somalia. We have got all these military ships looking out for, in case they want to drop some drones on somebody who might or might not be guilty of whatever it is they're supposed to be guilty of. And we can't police the oceans. What was it? Gracchus? Crassus? One of the guys in the first triumvirate is the guy who was famous for ending piracy in the Mediterranean. We can at least end piracy. We ought to be able to do that with all the ships we have. So yes, we need more for the oceans. Exactly what? I'm no expert on. But it's got to be a mix of they remain a commons, but they're regulated in such a way that they remain healthy for everyone.
Okay, good answer. Austin, we'll go to you for our last question.
I hope I'm not hammering the point too much, but I just want to come back to this account of small societies, specifically just limiting to hunter-gatherer societies. And I have a little bit of knowledge about 2 different societies that I've had some, visited with and had some contact with. One is an indigenous society in the northern part of Australia. And what popped into my head before you were talking about this, there's a group of 50 people, sort of, or this is a society at that level. And of course, a society of 50 people would be unviable, genetically speaking. So what these societies have come up to deal with that is that they do have groups, starting at 12, going up to 250 of the sort of primary social. Those groups, everything might be held collectively, but then they have relationships with neighboring groups. And for example, women from this group or men from this group are expected to marry into an adjacent group who marries into the next, and sort of goes around. So over 10 generations pass before, so no one's to keep the gene pool fresh. And those same groups will also have rules about who can hunt where, not as individuals, but as the collective. So we're allowed to hunt here this year. You're allowed to hunt here that year. No one's allowed to hunt in that spot because it's resting and the wildlife populations are coming back up. So whereas in South America, there was a Shuar community I went to, and it's completely the opposite. It's this sort of atomic household unit where there's the main river, and then there's each creek that feeds into the river. And then in each of those creeks, there'll be one patriarchal household where there's a man who's the boss of that household, and the people who can live there are the people he says he can live there. The people who can hunt along that creek are the people he says that can hunt along that creek, usually only members of that household, right? So in both, they're wildly different, but in both cases, there's sort of strong rules and claims about who has access to what when. It's often tied in with sort of patriarchy and marriage and sort of deeper social structures as well. And what I worry about is that if it goes beyond just debunking the homesteader myth or the appropriation myth, and it goes to be talking about the sort of the natural state for humans is to have this commons that we all have free access to, that opens up an avenue for attack, which is not really that necessary. If we don't, as Bethany was saying, if we don't link the previous what happened in the past to how we want to do things in the future.
Well, no, and absolutely, I don't do that. I'm not interested in doing that. One of the pieces of baggage that anthropology holds. Are you an anthropologist? Oh, you've been muted. Okay.
No, I studied philosophy, but I did some anthropology subjects, and I traveled with an anthropologist in South America, and so I'm anthropology curious.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, me too. I'm a sort of an armchair anthropologist that I've read a lot of anthropology, But I haven't done any of the work that an anthropologist does. Luckily, my co-author has. He's done both archaeology and ethnography. So it's good anthropology. The books are not just me dabbling in anthropology or him dabbling in philosophy. It's a philosopher and anthropologist getting together to make sure we have high level knowledge of both disciplines. But we are making no arguments that are saying because this is the natural human state, or this is the starting human state, we do it this way. That's one of the baggages that anthropology has from its past, that anthropology has gotten rid of more than 50 years ago. There is no such thing as the primitive, this unified root from where all of us stem. There is no dichotomy between civilized man and natural man. All human societies are equally natural in one sense and equally artificial in another sense. They're natural in the sense is what humans do is they get together and they figure out how to live together. And they figure out some cultural, traditions and ways that are some are similar to what other people are doing, some are unique to them. They solve their problems, they work together. Sometimes one imposes it on the others, other times people work it out together. People create their setting. In that sense, that's what people do. In that sense is natural. But the fact that they have created it, and that's not the only way it can be done, it is in that sense artificial. Natural in the sense, that's what beings of this species do. It's natural in the sense that it is created by human beings and it could be different and they can create it in many different ways. It is artificial. All societies are like that. And our society and the oldest, simplest technology society from 200,000 years ago, all have to be justified against the others. That is not any more natural and not anymore, that old society is not any more natural and any more justified because it's older. It's just people like us trying to solve their problems. They tried this, some of it worked, some of it didn't. Just like we're doing. Oh, yeah.
So the interesting comparison is between the egalitarian and non-egalitarian, not between modern and pre-modern societies. Then.
Right. Now, and it's interesting some of the rules that you found, because some of those rules sound like adaptations to the encroachment by larger scale groups. Very often, a small scale group will be well, it's these 50 people this year, but you find this summer, you find by this fall, 5 people left and 2 people arrived. And then by the next year, maybe by then 20 people have left and 20 others have come. It's more fluid and you probably don't have as much problem with making sure that you marry out because people are coming and going all the time. And you've got a good idea with your relationships across other communities and you're not going to interbreed. Now, regulation is a product of scarcity. The more things are becoming scarce, the more you need to get together and regulate them. And indigenous peoples have just as much a problem with this as we do. Indigenous peoples do not tend to be environmentalists, do not tend to be about preserving the stuff because they're used to abundance. They're used to there being plenty out there. And a lot of indigenous peoples have made horrible mistakes by this. The Maori got to New Zealand. They found they were farmers. They said, we don't need a farm. They got all these moa here. Let's hunt the moa. And for 200 years, that was great. And then they ran out of moa and the moa are never coming back. And then they all became farmers again. That was a huge mistake. We're making environmental mistakes similar to what the Maori made 1,000 years ago when they got to New Zealand. Same kind of mistakes. So it's not about one being superior and another being a spout. Here's an example of mistake. Let's not repeat the Maori mistake on the hunting too much, but let's also not fail to learn this lesson of something else that the Maori would have done right.
Okay, great. That's all the time we have. Thanks so much, Karl. Or did you have do you want any
I do
final
have one
words?
closing thing. So one thing that I didn't say is that one thing that I think is really important to this independentarian as idea is whenever the solution is possible of splitting up, you do it your way over here, I'll do it my way over there. That is the first solution that we should have. But that's not always going to work. That'll work for the Methodist Church goes here, the Episcopalian Church goes here. Everybody does it their own way and their own plan. That's fine. It doesn't work for the people who like to beat their children. Just go beat your children over there, and the area over here, nobody beats their children. No, I'm sorry. We cannot let you beat your children anywhere. That's just not acceptable. We must force you against your will not to do that. We cannot say, oh, the polluters will just go over here and the non-polluters will go over here. That's not going to work. We all breathe the same air. That we can't split up. But we've got to look, what are the ones where we really can't split up? Those are the only ones where you really want to prohibit. There is nowhere we can do it. And so if somebody wants to ride a motorbike through a motorbike through a dirt bike through the woods, if there's enough people, find a little bit of woods to do that, but don't do it in the same place where people are hiking. Use the splitting up solution. All right, so splitting up is one of the solutions. I guess it's an odd thing to end on, but I realized I should have said that somewhere along the way. So thanks a lot, Alex. Really, really nice of you to host these. I'm so glad this is such a great thing for basic income knowledge and stuff, that you're just putting these things out for everybody. Wish you the best of luck with it. Can't wait to you're almost at 100. I can't wait till you're at 200.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Love to have you back sometime. Thanks, Karl.
Glad to come back. Plenty I can talk
Thank you.
about. Thank you.
Carl.